Sean, welcome this afternoon. Thank you so much for carving out the time.
Of course.
Happy to be here.
Great. So, I want to take a step back and, we look at the tech industry, which is always constantly evolving. The last 2 years have been particularly interesting, right? If you look at the news and the headlines, there have been a lot of stories around data breaches and challenges in the work culture and so forth. How would you characterize this chapter of technology?
You want me to go first?
Sure.
I took an Ambien backstage, so we have about 15 minutes before I pass out.
Noted.
Let's see. I'd say it's more of a transition. I think sometimes the media narratives tend to be, this is the dark period in Silicon Valley now, and everything's changed. I don't think that's the case. I think what you're seeing is technology companies realizing we have a role to play in a bigger role to play in society and democracy, and we have a responsibility to societies and democracies, particularly in the context of the audiences we've built. And I think all of these companies recognize that. Jack at Twitter, who I'm obviously very close to, is doing, I think, a really good job of being public about the work the company's trying to do to improve the health of the platform. So I think it's a transition period. These companies will figure it out and deal with it, just like they've figured out and dealt with all the other issues in the past.
Sean, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think we forget how young tech is in general, and we're going through a period of learning. I mean, these platforms have grown to really empower society in ways that my parents weren't empowered to sort of be whoever they want to be and have a voice. And I think you have a generation that wants to work at a company that like social media has empowered them, like technology has empowered them, they want to be part of an organization that also empowers them to have a voice and find meaning in their lives and meaning in the work that they're doing. So I think the workplace is evolving, ironically, because of the power that technology has brought to society.
Dick, I want to come back to you for a minute. Obviously, you were CEO of Twitter for a good chunk of time.
Obviously.
Obviously. That being said, Twitter remains one of the go-to platforms for catching up in real time with news and breaking events. On the one hand, there's that. On the other hand, you have President Trump making it a go-to virtual pulpit. What do you make of that? How do you reconcile that?
I mean, Twitter is great at being able to connect with an audience immediately. And I think it was Obama in 2008, in his first election, who realized, maybe earlier than lots of other politicians, this is a great way to connect with people directly and without a filter. I think that's good. Being able to talk to people directly and without a filter, on both sides of the equation, both from being able to hear what the real message is from the politician and being able to see what they really think. And that goes, again, that goes both ways. With Trump, we all see what he really thinks. And we can see that sometimes he says things that are completely diametrically opposed to what he said 3 years ago on the same platform. He says things that are, known to be outright falsehoods that are there for everyone to see. I think that's a good thing that people can see that. It's not I think one of the things I would caution people about when they say, well, why don't, he should be removed from the platform or something, is it's not the platform's responsibility to resolve society's dysfunction. It's the platform's responsibility to make sure that it's not amplifying that dysfunction or getting in the way of society dealing with its own issues. And I think Jack and the company recognize that.
Got it. Sean, I want to talk about Tinder for a moment, obviously, which you co-founded and former CEO, obviously. Tinder, as many people I think would argue, has transformed the way people connect. That being said, you look a few years past the founding, and there's a slew of apps that have emulated Tinder's functionality. What do you make of that?
Look, I think it's great that there are developers that are taking inspiration from the work that Tinder's done and Twitter's done. I would say far more have emulated Twitter's functionality to an extent. It's humbling. We built a great product and focused on the user, and I think it's great to see that people take inspiration from that.
Got it. We talk about accountability. Dick, you talked about accountability a little earlier. One company that has been challenged around accountability is Facebook over the last 2 years, whether it's with the US presidential election or much more recently, data breaches and user privacy. What challenges do you think Facebook faces, and how accountable do you think they need to be?
Well, I think I think I'm going to say the same thing that Mark or Cheryl would say, which is that if you have an audience of over 2 billion people, you have an enormous responsibility, and you have to be accountable to that. You can't say, well, we built this audience of 2 billion people, and and we have no accountability to deal with any issues that come up on the platform. They have an enormous responsibility and accountability to that. I think what people have to remember is a lot of these things that the 2016 elections and meddling in the elections and so forth, those weren't things that people involved in these platforms knew about years in advance. We were dealing with, when I was CEO at Twitter as recently as 2015, we were dealing with spam and abuse and phishing and people stealing people's passwords to be able to hack into other credentials on other platforms. The election meddling, kind of hit us all in real time. And so whether it's Twitter or Facebook or anything else, I think these people involved in these companies know they have that responsibility and know they have accountability to this and are moving as quickly as possible to catch up to it. So I don't think that you'll see any of them shirk that responsibility or accountability. And it's going to be more enormous for Facebook because they're the bigger company. So that the onus is on them to deal with it.
Got it. Sean, what do you think?
I agree. But as they say, with great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah, that's right.
And again, we have to remember that there is no rule book for something like Facebook and what the correct way of operating Facebook or sort of shaping it in society is, because it's so new. So we're bound to make mistakes. I think what's important is that you have a leadership team that sort of has the right values and is learning from things like election meddling and preventing them moving forward. But we're bound to have, I'm sure we're going to have other issues moving forward, because you see this vast technology that has impact on 2 billion people. I mean, I don't even think any government in society has that amount of power on this many people. So I think it's really important to make sure that, number one, they're set up organizationally to learn from the users, represent all the users, and sort of have the right values that are important to that user base.
The other thing to keep in mind is, these platforms obviously operate globally and across countries, so they're not sort of bound by one country's constitution or laws. They're bound by all of them. And then you end up with all of these edge cases. Any individual case that comes up in the media sort of seems obvious to us as to, well, this is the way it should have been dealt with. But every day, I can just tell you from experience, within these companies, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of edge cases of what's the right thing to do here? This has never happened before. And there were times when we would remove content from Twitter because we thought it was in a violation of our terms of service, and then a photo, for example, of some terrorist activity, and then you would turn around and see that photo was published on the front page of a major global newspaper, and our users would say, well, why did you take that down? Mm-hmm. And then the flip side would occur. So it's just sort of an ongoing trying to figure out what the new answers are, as Sean just talked about. Lots of these things are happening for the first time, and then they're happening on platforms that are global and not bound by sort of one country's laws.
Got it. On the flip side of things, again, we've talked about Facebook and all those things, but on the flip side, which companies right now do you think are doing it right? Whether from a product perspective or a management perspective, are there any companies you're admiring right now?
You go first.
Oh, man.
You go first.
No, I think you should go first on this one. That's a tough one. I mean, I think it depends on how you define right. So it's a tough one for me to answer.
Okay.
I mean, look, they're all, my cop-out answer is going to be to name a bunch of companies that aren't in the news yet.
Right.
That no one's heard of, so people can go, okay. I think that, I'll say this, go back to the company I know best, Twitter. I think that Jack and the team at Twitter really, honestly, publicly are trying to figure their way trying to find their way forward and do the right thing. And they take a lot of, they get beat up a lot because they have been so transparent and public about the ways they're trying to resolve issues on the platform. And so when you do that publicly and transparently, and you make a mistake, you get beat up for it. But Jack has a very sort of pure way of thinking about the future of the platform and healthy conversations and the responsibility that he has for what the company's built. And I think they're approaching this the right way, trying to do it very publicly and not behind closed doors, and even making public emails that the trust and safety team sends out to the rest of the company about particular abuse issues. I think that's the right way forward, to do it, not behind closed doors, but out in public.
Transparency is key.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say it's necessarily just transparency. It's just trying to show in public what you're trying to accomplish as a platform. I think that's probably the right way forward.
Got it. Sean, from your experience at Tinder, it seemed like transparency was a huge element in scaling the company.
Yeah, I always felt that in order to build a great product for our community, we have to empathize and understand the community. And you want to create an environment where kind of all the different diverse voices are heard. So we did things at Tinder which I felt were a little unique. One thing we did was throughout, as long as we could, probably until about like 150, 200 employees, as long as it makes sense, any product feature or idea would be sort of presented in real time to the company at the all hands, and we invited the entire team to pick it apart. It made everyone feel included. It sort of showed everyone that they can and they do have the power to sort of weigh in on what we're doing as a company, and they can voice that opinion publicly to everyone. They can voice it to the CEO behind closed doors. So we didn't want a culture where sort of a service provider culture, where product sort of thinks of a great idea, passes it to engineering to build it, passes it to marketing to market it. We really wanted a more fluid process where the design sort of included all the voices throughout the company and all the voices throughout our community.
I think that's really what Sean is saying is an important aspect of culture for all the founders and CEOs in the room. I think that cultures in which people understand that the best ideas can come from anywhere in the company, and that facilitate that, and have many paths to yes, meaning, in a hierarchical organization, once you get one no, the idea is usually killed. If you facilitate that notion of the best ideas can come from anywhere in the company, and there are many ways to get to yes, those tend to be very successful cultures. They iterate rapidly, they learn rapidly, and they have a lot going on instead of sort of one small, narrow funnel of product features.
And I would almost say you have no choice today, because think about who millennials are as a generation and the generation after that. You're empowered to be whoever you want. Like no other moment in human history, you have the tools you need to access information, to voice your opinion, to be heard. So how could you expect to come into a company where you don't have that same privilege? So if a company isn't explaining to their employees why they're there and why their work matters, and isn't making them feel heard, then in a way that kind of contradicts everything else they're experiencing elsewhere in their lives. So why would you want to work at that company? So I think defining the why within an organization, creating purpose at all levels of the organization is more important now than it ever was before.
A little earlier, Sean, you mentioned diversity. I do want to touch upon that on two fronts. The first being is that one issue that has crept up in Silicon Valley, at least, is around conservatism within the larger workplace. There's this belief, at least by or argument by conservatives at companies like Google, for example, that there isn't room for a conservative viewpoint, that founders tend to lean liberal. What do you make of those arguments?
Oh, I think it probably varies by company. In San Francisco and California, it tends to be sort of a more liberal state, a liberal city and a liberal state to begin with. So the employee base is going to skew that way, and you can understand why people who are conservative in those organizations feel like they can't. It's not as easy for them to speak freely as it should be. So that doesn't, I think, come as any surprise to me. I think generally speaking on the diversity front, particularly in technology and the tech center, things are headed in the right direction there. I think it's just generally speaking. I think there's a lot less of this. Well, we have to have a single woman in our venture firm somewhere, but maybe she won't be a GP. And now there's a much larger understanding of, look, some of the best VCs in tech, Forerunner and on and on and on, are either women-led or all women. There's a group of former Twitter execs, #Angels, a whole collection of them that are sort of a powerful investment group now in the Valley, and when they sort of write on the subject of gender equality, and they just recently wrote this blog post called the Gap Table about women not just being underpaid on salary front, but underrepresented in the cap table. You see sort of a broad echoing of that. So I think that we're headed in the right direction on that front, and there's a lot more to be done there for sure. But that's all. I would say that's all skewing in the right direction.
Yeah. Sean, you're nodding your head in agreement.
I agree.
Okay. As we sort of wrap things up, what would be, many of people in the audience and people watching on the live stream are entrepreneurs themselves. You both have had obviously very entrepreneurial trajectories. What would be the one or two pieces of advice that you would give them as they navigate?
I had a founder who had just started his company, like a week into it, come up to me in a coffee shop in San Francisco the other day, and say, hey, can I ask you just a quick question? Like, if you have one piece of advice for me as I get started, what is it? And I knew the answer right away. And the answer is, it's always hard. Always. It's always hard. 100 people, 50 people, 1,000 people, 4,000 people. You think, like, once I get a VP of marketing in here, like, my life is going to, it's always hard. So you just have to keep grinding, always look ahead, keep thinking about, the next day, the next day, the next day, not looking back and regretting the mistakes you made. You're going to make a bunch of mistakes. Just remember it's always hard and keep grinding.
Persistence is key. All right, Sean.
Yeah, and I'd add to that you're going to have obstacles in life and in business. There's no such thing as a perfect company. There's no such thing as a perfect human. How you react to that is going to define the company. You can either, you face a challenge, you can either get angry, blame, sit there in kind of stillness, or you could use that as an opportunity to learn and grow. I think the most successful companies are iterative in nature, where they make mistakes and they learn from those mistakes and then become better as a result. That's sort of the evolution of humanity in a way.
That's right.
So I think it's really important to remember that an obstacle isn't a bad thing. Like, there's actually something good that can come out of it if you look for it.
You know what? If you're doing what you love, you become resilient. And when things go wrong, as they inevitably will, if you're doing what you're passionate about and love, you'll find your way through it.
All right. Well, Dick Costolo, Sean Rad, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.